to all of us here in the room and to those of you who are viewing this online this morning. Today we are announcing the BabySafe project. This is a critically important public awareness initiative to inform pregnant women about the potential dangers associated with early life exposures to wireless radiation, especially its effect on the developing brain. My name is Patti Wood. I'm the founder and executive director of Grassroots Environmental Education, which is a nonprofit environmental health organization based here in New York. We are creators of the BabySafe project in collaboration with Environmental Health Trust. The mission of Grassroots is to inform the public about emerging science that links common environmental exposures with a growing list of human health impacts. And much of our work focuses on children since they are disproportionately exposed and affected by environmental insults. Today we're here to talk about our very youngest children, those who aren't even born yet, and how wireless radiation may be impacting their development. The BabySafe project builds on a paradigm that is familiar to most women, that pregnancy is a time to be careful about certain environmental risks. It also rests on a principle that every mother understands instinctively, better safe than sorry, which is known in the scientific community as the precautionary principle. The BabySafe project combines old and new media in a comprehensive campaign to reach women all over America with our message of caution. Our website, babysafeproject.org, has 2 videos and lots of information for pregnant women about how they can protect themselves and their babies from unnecessary exposures to wireless radiation. Our booklets and pamphlets, hundreds have gone out already and thousands more are on their way to birthing centers, yoga centers, holistic moms chapters, and other associations and groups that serve pregnant women and young mothers. Our social media campaign on Twitter using the hashtag #KnowYourExposure is already trending with hundreds of mommy bloggers helping us to spread the message of knowing and reducing the exposure to wireless radiation. We also have a joint statement, and we are being joined in this effort today by a growing list of international experts who have signed on to a joint statement on pregnancy and wireless radiation. There is a current list of signatories in your press kit, but more names are being added every day as news of this project begins to spread. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to reach out directly to the manufacturers and purveyors of wireless technologies and ask them to join us in this effort to inform women and protect the most vulnerable among us. They are well aware of the biological effects of this technology. Every smartphone, wireless router, iPad comes with a warning not to hold the device close to the body. And we know that they care just as much as we do about the next generation. So we hope they will join us in supporting the BabySafe project. And my last but important point, and that is that the science is compelling and growing, and women have an absolute right to know about it so that they can make informed decisions to protect their children. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Hugh Taylor. He is the chair of the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at Yale School of Medicine and Chief of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Yale New Haven Hospital. He is also a professor of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. Good morning. If I can get my slides up.
It's the next slide.
Next slide? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about fetal radio frequency radiation exposure from cell phones and how it might affect behavior in mice. It's a study we performed in this animal model. As an obstetrician, I've been very interested in what happens during pregnancy, and it's now becoming very clear that various exposures to the fetus in pregnancy may result in lasting damage. That baby is programmed differently, develops differently, and may have some defects that aren't even apparent until later in life, maybe in childhood, maybe as an adult, maybe only as that individual ages. And it's our job to try and decipher what those potential insults might be and protect the next generation from this type of harm. There have been some reports about cell phone use in pregnancy that maybe stating that it might be harmful to the fetus, some epidemiologic studies that in women have associated high use of a cell phone with behavioral problems in children. But whenever we make these sort of associations, there are all sorts of other things that may be confounding that exposure other than just the exposure to the cell phone. For example, someone could say that a person talking on the cell phone excessively is ignoring their children, and that may be the explanation for these behavioral problems, rather than it being a direct result of the radiation from the cell phone during pregnancy affecting the development of that baby. So we designed an animal study to test it, where we would eliminate all those confounders. There would be absolutely no difference between two groups of mice, one that was exposed to the radiation from the cell phone during pregnancy and another group that had no radiation exposure. And this study we reported in 2012 in the journal Scientific Reports. To do this, we took, again, two groups of mice. We had 33 pregnant mice that were exposed to a cell phone, and 42 pregnant mice that were exposed to a non-active cell phone. And we looked at the effect of this exposure on the programming, on the development of the brain in the fetus, but looked not at the fetus, but looked at the mouse after birth. So we could see what an exposure during pregnancy did to that offspring later on in life as a child or as an adult. So in our study, we took muted and silenced phones that are as described here. This is a pretty standard run-of-the-mill cell phone. And they're muted and silenced, so there was no noise. The mice couldn't tell if the phone was on or not. There was no stress from the phone being on, background noise that was keeping them up at night. But the cell phone was in one group on and active, receiving a signal, and the other group, cell phone was turned off and put on top of the cage. Right in the middle of the cage, so they were, the distance you see here reflects a mouse right in the middle of the cage would be about 4 centimeters from the phone, and one at the edge of the cage was about 22 centimeters from the phone, and they were free to move about the cage. But again, these mice were exposed as a fetus. The moms were exposed while they were pregnant throughout the entire pregnancy, and then the offspring were tested when they became young adults. And this is what we found, and it's a busy graph, but I'm going to summarize for you. They had the mice that were exposed to cell phones. Again, these are the mice that were exposed while they were a fetus being tested as an adult. And this looks at, over time, the various ages. The mice exposed to the cell phone had decreased memory, were more likely to be hyperactive, were not anxious. They were very relaxed while they were doing this. No difference in fear. So these mice were forgetful, bouncing off the walls, and didn't have a care in the world. Very different behavior than those whose mothers were exposed to the cell phone that was turned off. And really completely the same in every other aspect. We can say that there's no difference other than phone being on or off between these two groups. So much more clear-cut, we can really talk about cause and effect here in this animal model, which the association studies in humans couldn't do. What does this look like? Well, the closest thing we could discern to this type of behavior in humans would be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or sometimes called ADHD or ADD. This is a disorder common and growing in children where they are hyperactive and they have difficulty paying attention and a tendency to act impulsively. This was, again, very similar to those hyperactive mice exposed to the cell phone. Now, I want to be careful. Mice don't get ADHD, and we can't say that this is exactly the same. But these types of behaviors in the mice were closest to ADHD. Not only did they behave differently, but we actually, in the mice, could take out some of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that controls these behaviors, and we looked at the electrical activity of the brain and at the synapses between two different brain cells. And we showed that they have a different electrical activity, that exposure to a cell phone as a fetus permanently programmed their brain to have a different electrical activity in this area that controls these types of behaviors. So not only was the behavior different, but we had a real biologic basis for it. Different brain development, different brain electrical activity. Good news, though, is that this change in brain activity did decrease with the exposure, so that those who had the lowest exposure had the higher or more normal synaptic electrical activity. It was the ones who had the 24-hour-a-day exposure during pregnancy who were the most severely affected. So the good news is there is a dose response, that lower exposures, less frequent exposure to the cell phone may be beneficial. So what are the implications for people? Well, again, when we're pregnant, I think it's important to keep that exposure to a minimum. Again, in our mouse model, we showed there's a dose response, that lowering exposure results in fewer problems. Matter of fact, very short exposures were similar to the control group. But where should we carry our cell phone? Probably not right as in this picture on the pregnant abdomen, not clipped to our belt next to the baby, not in a bag at our hip next to the pregnant abdomen. Probably keep that phone, move it away from the pregnant abdomen. Again, so it's not affecting the baby. The one thing we do know is that radiation effects dissipate fairly quickly with distance from the source of the radiation. So if you have your cell phone, it's sending out a signal. It's being picked up by a tower nearby, but the amount of energy correlates with the square of the distance from that energy source, the amount that's absorbed. So you move your phone twice as far away, you're really reducing your radiation exposure by a quarter, to a quarter of what it was. So even small, relatively small distances, moving that phone away from your body even a little bit can have a fairly profound impact on radiation exposure. So what do I tell patients to do? What do I tell pregnant women to do as an obstetrician? I say, move the cell phone away from the baby. People ask me all the time, should I not be talking on my cell phone when I'm pregnant? Well, moving that, if you keep your cell phone right at your pregnant abdomen, moving it to your head is probably actually a good idea. But I think the bottom line is the further away that the phone is from your pregnant abdomen, the better. Moving it a little bit away is a good idea, but certainly when someone's driving in a car, I tell them not to keep it clipped on their side. Put it on the seat next to them or the back seat. If you're in your office, put it, again, not at your side, put it across the room on a table. When you're home, don't keep it on your person all the time when you're pregnant. Place it down somewhere across the room. That type of distance will dramatically reduce the radiation exposure to the fetus, and probably the safe thing to do. We don't know yet whether the findings that we saw in the mice will be true in humans, or exactly what level of exposure is safe. But as we just heard, we should think about the precautionary principle. In other words, better safe than sorry. We know there can be harm from exposure, and we have some relatively simple ways to mitigate that, to reduce that exposure dramatically. I think just to put this in context, cell phones are certainly an area where we now have good data to suggest that they are affecting brain development. But what other fetal exposures are there that play a health in the next generation? As again, a practicing obstetrician and scientist studying development, it's important that we better characterize all the types of exposures that a fetus sees, to know which ones may be harmful. Many of those won't be manifest again until later in life, during childhood or as an adult, or even as we age. How many of us really know what our mother was doing when she was pregnant, and whether that affected any of the conditions that we may now be afflicted with, or how it has affected our behavior or health? We need to know more about these exposures and what they do. And there's a growing literature on this, and a growing enterprise investigating these types of exposures for long-term consequences. So what do we have to do? Do we have to go back to living on the farm and not ever have any electricity or use anything that might be anything other than organic or natural? Well, that looks nice, but I don't think we have to go quite that far. But I do think it's going to take some careful study of which things are very harmful, which things aren't harmful, and which things may be minimally harmful where we can easily mitigate the effects. And I think, coming back to cell phone exposure, that the cell phone exposure effects can be relatively easily mitigated just by moving that phone away from your body when you're pregnant. Relatively easy to do. There's really no downside to doing it. So I'll end by advocating that pregnant women be aware of this and do your best to keep your cell phone away from your baby. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. I would like now to introduce Dr. Devra Davis. She is the founder and president of Environmental Health Trust. She's a visiting scholar at the University of California at Berkeley and the founding director of the Center for Environmental Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute. An award-winning scientist and writer, Dr. Davis was a National Book Award finalist for When Smoke Ran Like Water, and her most recent book, Disconnect, was selected by Time magazine as a top pick and received the silver medal from Nautilus Books for investigative journalism. Dr. Davis.
Thank you very much.
Do you need some help with the,
Just to get my slides up. Yeah.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming here, and thank you all of you who are watching us from around the world, from India to Colombia to Mexico. We're grateful for your interest in this important issue. This is the last slide. We have a message for all of you that I want to make clear in my remarks today. As someone who's been working in the field of public health and was the founding director of the Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, I've seen how America discusses issues of public health and safety. And in all cases, from tobacco to asbestos to vinyl chloride to hormone replacement therapy, we insist on proof of human harm and damage before taking steps to prevent that harm. And basically it means sacrificing one generation eventually to protect another. I want to just give you some examples just to set the context. These are ads that actually appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, showing doctors smoking cigarettes, and they weren't hard to find because at one point 70% of all surgeons actually smoked. And there was a huge debate in the scientific community about whether or not tobacco smoke was truly harmful or whether the few people they thought then who developed lung cancer had a genetic weakness that predisposed them to it. So this was a serious effort, and the American Cancer Society actually accepted funds from the tobacco industry, and the Tobacco Industry Research Council was a very reputable group because back then there wasn't a lot of funding for research, and they funded research at Harvard and Yale and many other places, as I've documented in my books and scientific writings. And there was even a marketing campaign to aim to the fact that women always want to lose weight, saying reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet, it will help you lose weight. In fact, it is true. Nicotine does stimulate and suppress the appetite. But the idea that this was a marketing campaign to encourage women to smoke, which was very, very effective, this was an example of what we saw in our society in the beginning. This is an ad that you may not ever have recalled seeing about why asbestos can save your life if you happen to be a race car driver and a car that crashes. When life depends on it, you use asbestos. Well, we now know that there's a relatively rare lung-type cancer called mesothelioma, where 1 in 3 cases that occurs now has no known history of working with asbestos, which is telling us that environmental exposures to asbestos have in fact caused this rare cancer and will continue to do so. This, believe it or not, was an ad for asbestos in a baby suit so that we could protect our children from burning in a fire. I think it speaks for itself, and I can say to you as someone who's worked on public policy now for more than 35 years, When we look at the requirements that we put upon evidence on the dangers of passive smoke and on the dangers of asbestos, I don't think there's anyone in this room or anyone listening around the world who would think that we did not delay more time than we should have. And people are paying the price today for those delays. Now I want to review with you some experimental studies on wireless radiation exposure to the brains and behavior of rats and rabbits and mice. And I want to show you the results here from Gazi University, from Athens University, and from the Turkish Ministry of Health. I was able to collaborate with very distinguished colleagues there in Turkey, including Professor Nezrin Sahan, who is the founding chairman of Faculty of Medicine of Biophysics. And after the presentation that we developed in Turkey on this, the Turkish Ministry of Health banned advertising of cell phones with and to children, something that has been done in Belgium and is being done in other nations. They don't have trash-talking E-Trade babies in those countries. Now, this is just one example from the scientific literature, and more detailed studies can be found on the website for the BabySafe project and on the website for Environmental Health Trust. We are a scientific group that does research, primary research in this field, as well as develops public policy recommendations and education. This is one example from one study here by Professor Nezrin Sahan and her colleagues that looked at DNA damage in animals that were not exposed to cell phone-like wireless radiation and animals that were. Now, a word about radiation. A cell phone and a microwave radio use the same frequency, about 2.4 billion cycles a second or 900 million cycles a second. The power of a microwave oven is about 1,000 watts or 750 watts. So it's very powerful, and it can, in fact, boil a cup of water in about a minute or two. A cell phone is very weak in power, but the biological effect of the microwave radiation from the two-way radio that is your cell phone is not due to its power, but to its irregular, erratic signal, which disturbs cells. And you can see evidence of this in this study from Professor Sahan and her team. We're looking here at something called 8-hydroxyguanine, which is in DNA. It's the question of whether you can go into the DNA and form an adduct that gloms on to the basic nucleotide that's building and holding your DNA together. And this is showing that in the control groups, you get a very modest damage, but in the exposed groups, indicated here, you get 3 times more DNA damage just from exposure 15 minutes a day for 7 days when it's prenatal. The prenatal time, as we say in the Baby Wireless pamphlet, is a time of exquisite sensitivity. The faster cells grow, the more vulnerable they are to toxic exposures. We take great steps to protect the pregnant abdomen and to protect the brain and fast-growing cells in the human body. Now I want to talk to you about the work of Professor Suleiman Kaplan, who is the chairman of the Department of Histology Embryology at Onda Mayuz University, where I was privileged to meet with him and his extensive team of researchers. They also have studied prenatal exposure to microwave transmitting devices, and they have found that not only does it affect behavior, but it actually affects the brain. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that we use for thinking and memory. Professor Taylor showed you behavioral effects of cell phone radiation. This work, which was published in Brain Research, ties very nicely with his work, because what it shows is that you see in the control cells here, and I'm sure those of you who are not pathologists, you can see they're nicely packed and orderly and dense. Cells are supposed to be in line, right? They're supposed to stay together. These cells on the other side are exposed, and these cells are not exposed. Exposure took place early in life, late in pregnancy, and the results you can see quite right here is that there are fewer brain cells, and they're more in disarray if they were exposed to this radiation. The results here are what's called pyramidal cells, which are a type of cell within the hippocampus. And again, this is the thinking and memory part of the brain. You see, again, the disarray here in the exposed. This is the same magnification. There are more cells here. They're tighter together. There are fewer cells here. This is the work of Professor Odachi, also in Turkey. Now, I should say a word about this. We're dealing with a very complex phenomenon. I myself am trained in toxicology and epidemiology. I was a member of the board of scientific counselors of the National Toxicology Program of the US government. And we understand this is a complex issue scientifically. But right now, we are treating our children like experiments in a subject with no controls. It would be unethical if we were to say, let's take one group of pregnant women and expose them to cell phone radiation and the other group not. It would be unethical if we gave pregnant women alcohol, if we gave them tobacco and then said, let's study what's happening. So we need to understand that what we're doing now really makes no sense biologically based on this experimental work, because we're not mice or rats, but genetically we're not that different from them. And when it comes to developing drugs, we test them in mice and rats in order to decide whether it's appropriate to apply them to humans. Now what we're doing is we're exposing humans to this radiation, waiting till we get the data to show whether or not it's harmful. I think that there's something fundamentally wrong with that, and we at Environmental Health Trust are thrilled to be working with Grassroots Environmental Education to see that you all get more information about this. So I finally want to show you some studies also done with colleagues in Turkey on prenatal exposure to wireless transmitting devices that not only damage the brain and damage behavior, as Professor Taylor has shown you, but also damage the testes. And think again, rapidly growing cells are the most vulnerable. The brain of a baby more than doubles after birth and grows so many-fold from early in pregnancy that I've never seen a number on it. Prenatally exposed newborns here develop compromised spinal cords. Now, the spinal cord is the part of the embryo that ultimately becomes the brain. It starts out with just one cord, and it grows in size and density so that the top of it becomes the brain. And this is showing you here that in the unexposed, you have kind of nice cell full development in the center. And right here, you can see it's literally missing about half of what should be there. This is a stunning result obtained from Professor Odachi in a paper that has just come online. Although it was published 2013, it's not been reported in the literature. And we have all of that available for you on the website as well. And these are behavioral tests with these same exposed animals showing that when it comes to taking animals that have been deprived of food so that they're hungry and they want to get a reward, and you put them in a radial arm maze, so they have to learn where to get the food. The animals, the control animals, can get there really fast with little delay, and the EMF group that's previously been trained gets lost, and they have a harder time finding food, and they make more mistakes. Finally, this is a model of pregnancy. This has been developed by a joint project with the Swiss government, Andreas Christ there, and Niels Kuster. And you see we have biological models. These models are not used now by any of the national authorities to set standards for cell phones or laptops or any other devices. They're used when you want to evaluate the safety of a medical device, but not for the wireless devices that we're all using today. And this is a model that's being developed further of exposure, the red indicating pretty high exposures here. This is a 7-month-old exposure, and this is the 9-month-old. And I realize it's difficult to see the heads here. There's no question that we get exposure into the skin, and we want to protect the pregnant abdomen. And I really think it's wonderful that the manufacturers are giving this advice to people, and we are working now to encourage them to give the advice in a clearer way that people can understand it. So finally, what do we want you to do? We want you to avoid carrying your cell phone on your body, because, as Professor Taylor said, the closer you keep to your body, the more exposure you get. Cell phones have symmetrical antennas. So half of the radiation from the phone, when it's held next to you, gets into your body, and that means that if you hold it out here, you're actually going to have less demand on the network and much less radiation exposure. It's the square in millimeters away from you. So this distance could be thousands of times less exposure than right here. Avoid holding any wireless device against your body for the same reason. iPads come with multiple antennas, and it says in the iPad, don't keep it on the body. They are tested, and they are called tablets, not laptops, because they belong on tables. They do not belong on anybody's body. They're tested at a distance of 20 centimeters from the body. So they're not safe to use right on your body. Use your cell phone on speaker setting or with an air tube headset, and avoid using your wireless device in cars, trains, or elevators unless it's been tethered to your Bluetooth in your car, in which case you're using the car roof as the antenna. Otherwise, your head is the antenna. Avoid using cordless phones because cordless phones are like a mini base station. They are on 24/7, except in Switzerland where it's illegal to sell a cordless phone like that. They require that they only work when you use them, which we could very easily do in many other nations as well. When using Wi-Fi, try to use it only to download and then disconnect especially if you want to give a device to a child. Do not hand a child your phone or any other device unless it's disconnected from the wireless. So download what you want before you give it to anybody, especially a child. And frankly, avoid prolonged or direct exposures. Figure out where your routers are and stay as far away from them as possible, and get in the habit of turning them off. You can also ask your internet provider to power it down for you. Sometimes they will work at 10% of the power that they're on right now. You can unplug it and turn it off. And sleep as far away from any wireless digital device as possible. If you must use your phone as an alarm clock, put it on airplane mode. Airplane mode means that you can carry it next to your body because you're not getting Wi-Fi radiation. So we don't want to go through with this issue what we went through with tobacco and asbestos. We have more than 1 million cases of lung cancer this year in the world alone. Many of them could have been prevented. I repeat, if you want the future to be different from the past, let's study the past and let's make sure we make it different. And for more information, please look at the BabySafe Project website, as well as the websites for Environmental Health Trust and Grassroots Environmental Education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. And our final speaker this morning is Dr. Maya Sheatreat-Klein. She is an integrative pediatric neurologist, board certified in adult and child neurology as well as pediatrics. Dr. Sheatreat-Klein graduated from Albert Einstein College of Medicine with special distinction in research for her work in autism after graduating with honors from Columbia College. Dr. Sheatreat-Klein has her own practice here in the Bronx, and it is called Brain Mending. Dr. Sheatreat-Klein.
It's a particularly nerve-wracking time to be a parent. It seems like no matter what we do to keep our children healthy, we're still entering a lottery of diseases and behavioral disorders that are becoming more and more prevalent. With every new study, we're reminded that the incidence of things like ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, anxiety, depression, epilepsy, bipolar disorder, and Tourette syndrome are through the roof. Over the last decade in the United States, the number of children aged 3 to 17 with these developmental disabilities increased by double digits. 11% of children in the US, 6.4 million kids, carry a diagnosis of ADHD, with the number increasing by 5% each year from 2003 to 2011. Autism has increased nearly 80%. During this same period, the number of children medicated with stimulants or antipsychotics has more than tripled. A recent study showed that 1 out of every 5 children has been diagnosed with a mental illness. I care about these issues because I'm a mom, but I also care about them because I'm a pediatric neurologist. I'm one of the many people on the front lines of this epidemic every day, along with other healthcare professionals, therapists, teachers, and parents, working to help these struggling children and families. One question I'm often asked is why? Why did this happen to my child? These disorders are obviously complex and can't be necessarily explained by one factor alone, but sometimes we develop insight into contributing factors. Over the last several years, scientific studies repeatedly have found a strong association between in utero cell phone exposure and behavioral and attentional issues in childhood. For instance, the 2010 Danish Health Study evaluated pre- and postnatal cell phone exposure in nearly 30,000 children. Those exposed both before and after birth were 50% more likely to display behavior problems than children with no exposure. Children exposed to cell phones in the womb, but not after they were born, showed a 40% higher risk of borderline behavior problems. And those not exposed to cell phones before birth, but who were using them by age 7, were 20% more likely to have behavior problems. This study was large and therefore statistically powerful, and was also rigorous in ruling out other confounding factors that may have explained these differences. It also confirmed similar findings from earlier studies. And as we're seeing today, disturbing scientific data continues to be revealed regarding the effects of cell phone radiation on developing brains. As a physician, I have to evaluate information about various risks every day. I have to ask myself, do these studies make sense? Is this exaggeration or is it legitimate? And what advice do I offer the families in my practice? Well, each day of pregnancy, a complex symphony of cells in the fetus are growing, migrating, and connecting to one another to become a functioning brain and nervous system. By week 6 of pregnancy, the forebrain forms, and there is already evidence of brainwave activity. The neural tube that connects the brain to the spinal cord closes at this time. By week 17, the brain's left and right hemispheres are developing, and by week 19, millions of neurons are developing. By week 23, the neurons begin to rapidly connect to one another to form a system of communication. This rapid development and growth continues all the way through birth and beyond. When the nervous system is developing so quickly, it also is more vulnerable to interruptions that can disrupt cell growth and connectivity. We know that exposures that occur during pregnancy can have lifelong impact due to these window periods of vulnerability that occur as the brain grows and develops. Wireless radiation is an exposure that has been shown to negatively affect developing brain cells. And children, due to thinner skulls, smaller brains with more liquid cushioning them, softer brain tissue, and a higher number of rapidly dividing cells, are also more susceptible to damage from cell phone exposure than adults. Certainly, babies in the womb, who are perhaps the most vulnerable population of all, seem to be at the greatest risk from all such exposures. What then is my professional conclusion? Though brain development is a complex process that can be influenced by many different factors, growing scientific evidence indicates that in utero cell phone exposure can cause harm. More and more data supports this conclusion that the harm may well contribute to neurobehavioral disorders of childhood. In such a situation, I believe that parents and future parents have a right to be made aware that there are risks from this common and widespread exposure. I will say it again, parents and parents-to-be have a right to know so that they can take steps to protect their children. The precautionary principle, which we've already heard about, holds that when significant risks to public health are suspected, efforts should be made to reduce those risks when possible, even when full scientific understanding is incomplete. Given the number of children suffering from behavioral and attentional disorders, I advise that pregnant women and parents take preventive measures when using cell phones. This means when a pregnant woman or her partner uses a phone, keep it away from her belly and ideally her body. Don't put phones in your pocket while they're on. Minimize exposure in your home by turning off the phone and the Wi-Fi at night and other times that it's not needed. In this case, less is more. Let's work together, doctors, scientists, parents, and industry, to protect the brains of our children. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all very much for sharing your time with us, and we would like to know whether anyone has any questions that you could ask of our experts. They're right here in this room. They have an incredible body of knowledge between them that that we could tap into. Yes.
These were all behavioral studies, so nobody's looking at tumor growth or anything like that at this point in these studies.
Hugh.
Well, we haven't reported this yet, but I can give you some data. At least in our prenatal exposure, we did not find an increase in brain tumors. Now, again, that may not apply to an adult holding a phone right by the brain. But from our studies, that was not something we saw.
So, but you look for that.
We did look for that.
Okay.
We haven't reported and published that yet, but that is a finding, yes.
Right. And when it comes to the animal model for studying brain cancer, that's actually not a simple thing, because it's actually very difficult to get these rodents to make phone calls. And by that I mean that the model for exposure here is really critical. And the amount of exposure that you get and that children get is really quite high. We know that studies that have been done in Scandinavian countries, unfortunately on real humans, have found the following. For kids who start to use cell phones before teenage years, or in the early teenage years, they have between 4 to 8-fold more brain cancer by the time they reach their late 20s. Now, I think this is not about cancer, because the cancer issue is very complex. I am trained as a cancer epidemiologist, as some of you know. This is about damage to reproduction. This is about damage to the brain and behavior that we are showing you here in experimental studies does take place. And the cancer issue is really complex. It's going to take a long time, and the latency for humans for brain cancer may be between 20 to 50 years. And the reason I say that is the Hiroshima data on those who survived that bombing show no increase in brain cancer showed up in that population of survivors until 40 years after that. So are we really going to wait 40 years, given the tremendous growth of exposure we see now to ourselves and our children, who are growing up in a sea of radio frequency radiation that has never existed in human history even 5 years ago? So the cancer question is complex. There will be some resolution of this by a study underway now at the National Toxicology Program. But until we get those results, what are we doing? We need to better be safe than sorry. And that's why we want to focus the attention on the brain and behavior and reproduction. Thank you.
Let me add one point of clarification to what I said about my study as well. Brain cancers are relatively rare events. You'd need to look at a lot of animals. The behavioral problems that we saw were very common. Most of the mice individuals were affected. If a brain cancer is occurring 1 in several thousand, you would need several thousand mice before you'd see one. We did not have that many, so our study was not powered to adequately look at brain cancers, which is why we did not report it in our original publication. It wasn't designed to do that, underpowered to look at that.
Yes.
What is the ongoing research for this? What centers? Are centers doing ongoing research in the United States?
The question is, where is this ongoing research taking place, here in the United States or in other countries? Dr. Davis?
I'm leaving tonight for Cape Town, where I'll be attending the meeting of the International Biomagnetic Electric Society. There are fewer than 1,000 members in the world who belong to the Bioelectromagnetic Society. We are not investing the money that we need for this research. So the answer is that doctors like Professor Sheatreat-Klein are on the front lines of doing the, quote, research with real kids, unfortunately, today. And the funding for Professor Taylor's study was provided by a private donor. So the United States today has a paltry investigation in this, except for one large animal study. Professor Nora Volkoff, director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, produced a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association that was published in 2011, showing effects on the brain from a cell phone exposure when the phone was just left on. And she found a significant change in glucose metabolism in the brain. Now, we don't know what that means. She was not able to get funding within the US government to follow up that study. This is a big problem, and that's why Environmental Health Trust has joined with Professor Joel Moskowitz at Berkeley in calling for a $1 a phone fee to be placed on every phone or digital device, with it being paid by the consumer, the internet provider, and the manufacturers of phones, to create funding for training, because we have no training with 1,000 experts around the world, and for the research, such as the follow-up studies to what Professor Taylor has done. This work desperately needs to be followed up. We have very few people in this country who are trained in this field. And this is a serious, serious problem. So the answer is we don't have a tremendous infrastructure addressing this. And I've often said that if cell phones were a drug, they would be illegal. They've never been tested for safety. They were tested originally on a big guy, heavy set, talking for 6 minutes, back when phones were chiefly used by medical or military, mostly men. And that standard applies to every device that you all are using, and that when you hand your child a phone as a pacifier, which it is not, that standard obtains as well.
But is there not data being collected? I mean, they're used all the time in society, every day by everyone. Is there data collection that can be done on what is existing?
Where's your control group? Okay? We have, that's a serious.
Previous generations.
Well, no, that becomes problematic because the previous generations have different experiences. If you just think about, literally, when I say 5 years, this digital generation, these kids are growing up digital, is so fundamentally different, particularly because some of the approach, the recommendations for Connect Ed, that all of our schools should be floating with wireless, this flies in the face of what we understand in science. The Israeli Health Ministry looks at all this evidence, and Israel relies on Wi-Fi for their security. They rely on radar, which is what this is. And they recommend no Wi-Fi in Israel before grade 3, none. And whenever possible, if there's a computer in a classroom, they recommend it be wired. It's not that hard. You can even wire your iPads, your MacBooks, because you can get a port that you put in that takes the Ethernet cable. Wired is safer, it's more secure, and it means less exposure to children. Remember, they don't call them laptops anymore, they call them tablets because they belong on tables. And we hope that with this initiative, the Grassroots Environmental Education and Environmental Health Trust have started here with the BabySafe project. We're reaching out to pediatricians, to obstetricians, to work with us, to work with the companies to see that people have information about safer practices so that we don't wait for the data. But you're absolutely right. We need to encourage better monitoring, better surveillance so that, again, people like Dr. Sheatreat-Klein will have fewer patients to treat.
I have a question for Dr. Taylor. How are your patients reacting to this information? Are they scared? Do they feel?
Yeah. So the question was, how are patients reacting when I tell them about some of the findings that we've had? I think they're appreciative. I find that most people are, during pregnancy, looking to protect their baby, looking to protect their fetus. I find that information is really welcome, typically. I haven't had anybody tell me that they're somehow frightened by that information. Most people are keen to act on it. And it's so simple to do, too.
Let me just show you an example of a bad idea. This is a plastic teething rattle case for an iPhone. Okay? You can buy it at Toys R Us or a lot of other places, and they also have a plastic teething rattle case for an iPad. Now, this is marketed to people like me, a grandmother. My daughter is about to have her second baby. She'll have 2 under 2, and she fortunately knows what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends, which is that children under 2 have no screen time, none. And yet many people don't know this and have the money to buy these things and are giving them to their grandchildren. Usually it's grandparents who buy these things, by the way. And think of the cost and the exposure that you're giving the young brain with something like this. It's the whole body, because of course their arms are shorter. The iPhone is tested at 2 positions, a few millimeters off the head and at a holster on the hip. It's never tested in the breast pocket or the shirt pocket. And the U.S. General Accountability Office issued a report a year and a half ago that said that the FCC ought to promote realistic testing of these devices as they are used. And that is not taking place now. And this certainly, if this had ever been tested, and there is no requirement for testing of cases, it would certainly not be permitted. And I hope we are working now with the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has issued a statement to the FCC urging that they update the standards. Look, cell phones were first tested and standards issued 18 years ago. Would you like to fly in an airplane that has standards that are 18 years old? Or ride a car that complied with 18-year-old standards? Well, actually, US standards 18 years ago for safety were not too bad, because we put airbags and seatbelts on a lot of cars. We need the equivalent with the phones today. We're not telling you not to use them. We're telling you to use them less and to use them in a smarter way. And we need to develop the software and the hardware to come up with the equivalent of airbags and seatbelts for phones.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
I have a very American question.
Yes.
What is the accountability, what is the responsibility, what is the liability of the cell phone companies for producing a product that hurts people?
The question is, what is the responsibility or the liability of companies that produce cell phones? And anyone would like to answer that? Devra?
Well, the book I wrote, Disconnect, which is available on Amazon, and I urge you to buy the one with the Scream cover, has a chapter on this. And one of the things it reports there is that currently secondary insurers for health damages from cell phones, like Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re, do not cover health damages from cell phones. And they made that decision several years ago, reasoning that cell phones for them could become like asbestos. That is what these secondary insurance companies decided. So the cell phone companies, manufacturers, are among the most profitable in the world today. And I'm pleased to tell you that I'm working with some of them behind the scenes right now, because they understand they've got to make devices that emit less radiation. There's no debate about that. The only debate is going to be, when are they going to come forward, because there are legal liability issues. And in my book, Disconnect, I document that the cell phone industry understood in the 1990s that these devices that they were marketing could prove hazardous. And the first response, which is in the afterword in the paperback edition, to the first report by Professor Henry Lai and Vijay Singh, that cell phone radiation looked like it damaged brain cells in animals. The response of industry was in a memo, which I quote in my book, from Motorola to their public relations firm, saying, "We think we have sufficiently, quote, war-gamed, quote, the science." And that was the response in 1994, before that article that ultimately got published was published. So that's what we had in the past. Now, I'm pleased to tell you that I'm working with people like former executives for the Bayer Corporation in India, Prakash Munshi, and others who worked with Hewlett-Packard, and others who work with some of the companies today. For example, the former president of Microsoft Canada, Frank Clegg, and they all recognize we've got to do better. So we are making some progress with some people in industry, but it's going to be a question of getting that rising tide to lift all of them to the same level of understanding that we need to keep our children safe, and it's better to be safe than sorry. Right?
There are no other questions. I'd like to thank all of you in the room here, and those of you who are online on the web, and have a nice day. And we hope that you will visit our website, which is babysafeproject.org. On that website, you will find 2 videos, a science video and an introductory video, as well as the joint statement and the list of current signatories on that joint statement. There will also be many different recommendations for using cell phones safely while you are pregnant. And we urge anyone to contact us through the website to receive a booklet that we have produced, and that would be something that any OBGYN could be providing for their patients, and we are making them available for free. So please don't hesitate to contact us, and thank you very much, everyone.